Now, I saw this video that the Daily Mail, true crime, they put together this video of the evidence that convicted Erin. It's very interesting. So I'm going to react to it. I'm going to play it. I've give them credit in the description of this video. Very good video, very well put together. And the guy who has prepared it, I'm trying to find his name. Oh, where's his name? Yeah, this guy's called Guy Adams, and he's done like an evidence box. I don't know if he does it in general for crimes or whether he's just done it specially for this one. Let's just have a look at another few pictures of Erin, though he will be showing photos. There she is. I love them. I didn't hurt them. I love them. Obviously she didn't. There's Erin. There's her true self showing right there in her face. If looks could kill, we'd all be dead now. Here's Ian, the only survivor, bless him. Oh, now he has returned to church to do a sermon, which is nice. And if we've got time at the end, I might show that because that's nice and positive. Good for him. So because he's a pastor, he's gone back to his services. Good for him for doing that. And of course, for anyone, if you've been on Mars for the last few weeks and you don't know about this case, Erin Patterson was the woman who killed 3 of her estranged husband. This is her estranged husband, Simon. Erin poisoned 4 of his relatives with death cap mushrooms, which are the really toxic mushrooms. She put them in a beef Wellington, invited them round to lunch, and they died. And Erin had a little bit of diarrhea, she says, which I think that's been totally debunked really now, hasn't it? And, we had this very long trial. This is Erin's solicitor, Colin Mandy. Then we had the prosecutor, who was brilliant, Dr. Nanette Rogers, who she had to pull it all together. She brought over 50 witnesses, one of which was Funky Tom, the mushroom expert. It was a very long, drawn-out, but interesting trial. This is Justice Beale. I think these are death cap mushrooms at the side of him. It was a very long trial, and the only witness called for the defense was Erin herself. They called nobody. The prosecution called over 50 witnesses, and the defense only called Erin Patterson. She spoke for 3 days on the dock in her own defense, told lie after lie after lie. She was caught out in so many lies, wasn't she? And, practically wore out my Pinocchio book. She wanted everyone to believe her, even though her lies were shown up, and he's going to talk about those. Now, this guy, he was actually there in the courtroom. Honestly, I would have, and he gives this interesting insight. I would have loved to have been there, because the thing is, you want to see Erin's, we read about it, didn't we? Because the reporters were allowed to report on it, but we weren't allowed to see any video or anything. But this guy was actually there in the courtroom, and he gives very interesting insights, I think, about, where Erin went wrong. I'm going to subscribe to that, actually. Oh, I am subscribed. Where Erin went wrong, the lies she told, that he was there and he heard the jury sort of sighing, you know, like, oh my God, you know, she's telling another lie. So, yeah, very interesting insight this. So this is him with the evidence box. Let's have a look.
My name is Guy Adams and this is Evidence Box. This is a trial a case that is predominantly about mushrooms, and here in the evidence bag we have a mushroom. In this trial, the type of mushrooms that were at the centre of the case did not look like this. The type of mushrooms was a variety known as the death cap. You can see it here. Now, there's a reason the person in that picture is wearing a blue glove, and that's because death cap mushrooms are incredibly poisonous. In fact, during the case, we heard from a number of mushroom experts. This is a very important one in the context of the trial.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. It made me think after I've seen this. So anybody who was handling death cap mushrooms, they were wearing gloves. So Erin's supposed to have just took them out of her Tupperware box and put them in the sauce for the beef Wellington, and she's supposed to have tasted it, because he says that she said when she tasted the sauce, the paste, they've got a special name for it that I can't remember, she thought, oh, it lacked something. So then she remembered these mushrooms that she had in a Tupperware box, and supposedly she took them out of the Tupperware box, presumably without gloves on, added them to the sauce she was making, and she must have tasted it again. You know, if you taste something, like say you're making a bolognese or anything, and you taste it and you think, oh, it's lacking something, maybe it needs a little bit more salt, a little bit more pepper, a little bit more tomatoes, whatever, a little bit more stock. So you put more of whatever you think it's lacking in. Obviously going to taste it again, aren't you? So is Erin really seriously saying that she tasted this sauce, it was lacking something, so she put in these mushrooms and then she didn't taste it again? You know, she could have, I don't know about you when I'm making sauces, and, you know, I like tasting. You know, that's the whole point, cooking part of it, isn't it? Making a bolognese, you have a little spoonful of it, don't you? You know, a little bit more red wine in there, or a little bit more salt, or whatever. You know, that's what you do. You taste things as you go. When you're cooking at home, I mean, you're not in a bloody restaurant where you're probably not supposed to taste things. But, you know, when you're at home and you're cooking something, of course you taste it. So she's supposed, she's trying to say that she just plucked out these death cap mushrooms from a Tupperware box, put them in there, you know, and everybody else is handling them like the bloody kryptonite or something. But oh no, not Erin.
Trial. He's a man called Tom May. His nickname is Funky Tom. Now, he appeared in the witness box and told us exactly what happens if a human being ends up eating one of these mushrooms. And basically, over the course of about a week, all of your vital organs shut down and you are likely to eventually die. Your liver is probably the first thing and most important thing to go. Erin Patterson lived in Victoria, a state in southern Australia. She lived in a rural town called Leongatha, about...
Oh, what did that say? Arrive alive, take a break. They should... Sorry, I missed that.
He's a man called Tom May in southern Australia. She lived in a rural...
Leongatha, arrive alive, take a break. Oh, God. Oh, dear me. That's ironic, isn't it? Arrive alive. You know, as long as you don't eat any beef Wellington prepared by Erin Patterson. Yeah, so it attacks your liver. These mushrooms attack your liver. Poor Heather, Ian's wife, her liver was completely dead. And she was so ill, she couldn't be given a transplant. Whereas Erin had a little bit diarrhea, if you even believe that, of course.
A town called Leongatha.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. But, you know, the more I now read about this, the more ludicrous the whole thing sounds, what Erin was expecting people to believe. It's just, and I'm going to prepare this video that I've got, I'm preparing at the moment. I'll finish it over the next couple of days. The myths about Erin Patterson. One, that she's intelligent. She's not intelligent, because anyone who's intelligent would never think they could get away with this. She's not intelligent.
About 2 hours drive southeast of Melbourne. Now, in that part of the world, death cap mushrooms tend to grow in the autumn, which is in the months of April and May, when it's starting to get rainy. And they're quite rare, but they pop up underneath oak trees. Now, the prosecution's case was that Erin Patterson deliberately sought out these quite rare and highly poisonous mushrooms in order to feed them to her guests at a lunch that took place in July 2023. The defence's case was that she definitely did feed her guests death cap mushrooms.
Now, the only thing I don't like about this video is they keep changing the camera angles. I'm not sure why. Why can't we just look at him and he's talking to the camera? Why do they keep changing it so he's just looking? Where is he even looking? Has he done this himself or what? Anyway, I don't know. I don't like that style. Just look. I like to look at someone's eyes. It's same with all the YouTube channels that I watch. It's like I like to see people's faces full on.
That day, but that this was an accident. The defence argued that Erin foraged for mushrooms, it was a sort of hobby, and that the whole thing was a terrible mistake, and she inadvertently thought that a mushroom that looks like that was edible, much like a mushroom that looks like this ought to be. Item number 2.
Having said that, I don't like YouTubers who go right in your face. Like some of them you watch and it's like they're literally nose to nose. I don't like that either. I think that's very aggressive.
The murder weapon. Coming back to that beef Wellington. Now, for those of you who don't know, the beef Wellington, I'd describe it as a staple dinner party dish. It's a whole fillet of beef wrapped in pastry and then baked in the oven. But importantly, and you'll see, I'm just about to pull it apart, in between the beef and the pastry, there is a layer of something called duxelle, which is a kind of reduced fried pate made out of mushrooms and garlic. And that is essentially how the poisonous mushrooms found their way into Erin Patterson's lunch. Now, at a normal dinner party, what you do is you slice your beef Wellington, and each guest will get a slice of beef Wellington on their plate, probably with a bit of gravy. On that fateful day in July 2023, Erin Patterson didn't actually make a beef Wellington. She made 5 of them. Each was a bit smaller than this one, and one individual beef Wellington was served to each of her 4 guests. Now, those 4 guests were all relatives of her estranged husband, Simon, with whom she had 2 children. They were Simon's parents, Don and Gail, his aunt Heather, and Heather's husband, Ian, who was the local church pastor. 3 of those 4 guests
are in the cemetery, yeah. And don't forget, of course, we know now that probably on at least 4 other occasions she had tried to kill Simon. Apparently she'd made him some sort of wrap thing, chicken wrap. She'd cooked him some cookies. What was the other thing? So, yeah, she tried to kill Simon. I think Simon was the intended target. But she was just so angry with him and his family. She's just such a nasty person, this woman.
Died. The 4th, Ian, he survived, but he had to spend about a month in hospital. And he gave evidence at the trial about what happened when they went to lunch that day. It was an agreed fact that the beef Wellington did contain death cap mushrooms. The question for the jury was how they got there. The prosecution, of course, said it was deliberate. She wanted to kill her guests. Erin Patterson said it was all a bit of an accident. And specifically, she says that when she was cooking that duxelle on the morning of the lunch, it was a Saturday, she was in her kitchen and she was sort of tasting the dish as she cooked it. And she decided that it wasn't quite mushroomy enough.
So apparently she's tasted it. It's not mushroomy enough, so she's gone and put in those other mushrooms. You're telling me she didn't taste it again? Of course she did.
used a box of just normal mushrooms from Woolworths, the local supermarket. And she said that in order to make it taste a bit stronger, a bit more mushroomy, she'd use some dried mushrooms, something that, the type that look a bit like this. And she said she kept a load of dried mushrooms in a Tupperware container in the cupboard in her kitchen. And we'll come back to this crucial bit of the evidence later. The next crucial bit of evidence involved plates. Now, when Ian Wilkinson gave evidence at the trial, he said that Erin Patterson had seemed a little odd on the day that they had the lunch. He said,
yeah, the plates are crucial, aren't they? The plates are, I've been obsessed by the plates right from the beginning. As soon as Ian said those plates, the colour of those plates, and those plates were no longer at Erin's. So like some people think that maybe she took because within half an hour of the lunch guests leaving, she was down the dump, wasn't she? Dumping a load of cardboard. And you couldn't see her dumping any plates, but people say maybe they were hidden somewhere and maybe it just wasn't captured on CCTV. Just seems strange, doesn't it, that just after you've had a nice lunch, would you really think to go to the dump after that? And also, don't forget, at some point, she's supposed to have had 3 portions of bloody orange cake or whatever. So, yeah, but no, sometime in between, she got to the dump and dumped a lot of stuff, but we don't know what.
And she didn't really want anyone else to come into the kitchen. And when she served the dish for everyone, she put a beef Wellington on their plate. She put some green beans. She put some mashed potato. And in evidence that made me think she was probably a pretty bad cook, she ladled out some gravy that she'd sort of bought in a packet and poured that on top. Ian said that each of the guests was served by Erin on a particular type of plate. He said it was a grey plate. Now that's important because Erin, according to Ian, did not eat her lunch off the grey plate. Erin ate her lunch off a plate that looks something like this, although Ian actually said it was slightly smaller than the grey plates. This was crucial. The prosecution claimed that the reason Erin used colour-coded plates was that her beef Wellington was not poisonous and that the ones she served her guests were poisonous. And the prosecution claimed that it was a sort of insurance tactic by Erin, a way of making sure that she didn't accidentally feed herself one of the 4 poisoned beef Wellingtons.
I mean, the thing is, Ian was such a convincing witness. He's clearly an honest man. And Erin, of course, had told all those other lies. So, obviously the jury were more likely to believe Ian. Why would he lie about the plates being different colours? And the other thing is, he actually had that conversation. Heather actually said, or was it Gail, said to Simon, oh, hasn't Erin got a full dinner service? Because people notice things like that, the differences between the plates. And also those grey plates were never, ever found. So that makes it all suspicious. But Erin said, no, he was mistaken.
Erin, when she gave evidence in her defence, actually claimed that Ian had got it wrong. She didn't call him a liar. He was quite a convincing witness in many ways, but she did say he was mistaken. She said she didn't own any grey plates and that she'd served everyone on completely different coloured plates, some black, some white, because she didn't actually own any that looked the same. It was one of the issues that the jury had to make a decision on and decide who was telling the truth. Another important piece of evidence, it involved the investigation into the lunch by the local public health authorities. When they realised that people had eaten death pack mushrooms, their immediate concern was obviously to find out where on earth these had come from and to prevent anyone else from falling sick. So public health officials carried out a number of interviews with Erin. And that brings me to another piece of evidence. These are some shiitake mushrooms. They're dried Chinese mushrooms. Now, when Erin was asked by those public health officials,
they're my favourite mushrooms. They're so lovely, those.
Where she'd got the mushrooms that she used in her lunch from, she'd said they came from 2 places. She said some of them had come from the local Woolworths, fresh mushrooms, and she then claimed that some of them had been dried mushrooms that she'd bought from an Asian supermarket. That caused a bit of a panic amongst public health officials. Obviously, if an Asian supermarket's selling dried death cap mushrooms, lots and lots of people could be about to die. So they were very, very keen to find the source of these mushrooms. But Erin Patterson said she couldn't remember where that supermarket had been. There was no record on her bank statements or card statements of any point of sale.
Yeah, Erin with the terrible memory couldn't remember anything until, suddenly when Nanette Rogers said about a certain date, and said it was a certain day, and Erin went, no, that was a Friday. Nothing wrong with Erin's memory. It was just a ruse.
Purchase in an Asian supermarket. Erin said, I must have paid cash. She gave a sort of rough neighbourhood she couldn't quite remember. Public health officials went to a number of shops trying to find mushrooms with the sort of description Erin gave. They couldn't find them. And it was only in court that Erin changed this evidence somewhat. She said, yes, I did have a Tupperware container full of dried mushrooms from an Asian supermarket in my kitchen that was added to the duck cell as I was cooking. But, she said, I'd also put in that Tupperware container some of the mushrooms I'd foraged and then dried out. And they must have all got a bit mixed up, and that's how my guests were poisoned.
And don't forget, though, this is what she came up with at her trial. Originally, she told the police she'd never foraged for mushrooms. She never forages for mushrooms. She didn't have a dehydrator, all that. And now suddenly, for the trial, yes, I do forage for mushrooms. Must have just got mixed up.
I now want to talk about another piece of food, in this case, a cake, or more specifically, an orange cake. Now, the reason I want to do this is quite simple. A lot of the trial revolved around the question of how 3 of Erin's 4 guests died, and one of them very nearly died, when Erin didn't. Now, the prosecution's case, of course, as we know, is that Erin had made sure that her beef Wellington didn't have any death cap mushrooms in it. The defence's case was a little more convoluted. Now, Erin said she basically cleared things up. She went around the room, and at some point she chanced upon an orange cake. It had been made by Heather Wilkinson, one of the guests. Because everyone's beef Wellington was quite large, not very much of this orange cake had been eaten. But Erin looked at it and says she suddenly felt quite hungry. Now, at this stage in her evidence, Erin told the jury something which she'd never told anyone in her life before. She said that she'd been struggling with body image issues from quite early on in her life, and that for most of the last 20 or 30 years, she'd actually been suffering from bulimia. And when she was...
Yeah, so bulimia, of course she's got bulimia. The thing is, we're bearing in mind, she's only just come out with this. She's never mentioned it to anyone. She's never been for counselling about it. She's on this whole pity party thing. Oh, feel sorry for me, I've got body image issues, I've got bulimia, blah, de, blah, de, blah, de, blah, de, blah. Clearly she hasn't, because she'd never, ever discussed it or mentioned it. Now, okay, maybe, people do keep these things secret. But, it's just obvious that it was a lie, another lie. And what she was trying to do was say that the reason she didn't get so ill as the others, because the dramatic difference. We're not talking about, that Erin got really ill, but she managed to survive like Ian did. She just never got really ill. All the others are so ill that they're in intensive care, put in comas. Ian survived by the skin of his teeth, and Erin's got a little bit of diarrhea. And she's trying to say that the reason for that is because she made herself sick with the orange cake. Also because obviously she's quite a big lady. She's maybe a bit more substantial than the others. Oh, and she took some Imodium. As if Imodium would help if you'd been eating death cap mushrooms. So she came out with all this crap reasons about why her symptoms weren't as severe as the others, but the difference was too much. Again, this is another contributing factor to why the jury just didn't believe her. Because, you might say, there were just nothing alike, the symptoms. Anyway, Apparently it's because she threw up this orange cake.
Asked about this by her barrister, Colin Mandy. He said, well, how does this manifest itself? And like all bulimia, you eat too much of something and then you make yourself sick. Erin said that she saw this cake and she ate a slice of it. And then she was asked, what did you do next? And she said, well, I ate another slice and another slice and then another until I'd eaten the whole cake. At this point, Erin was asked what had happened after that. And she claimed that she then went to the bathroom and made herself sick. Now, it's the defence's case that in making herself sick, Erin must have vomited up quite a lot of that lunch and probably most of the beef Wellington. And that this explains why, although they claim she was a little bit sick, she wasn't as sick as the others. This brings me to the next item of evidence, some toilet roll and a poo bag. Now, we heard in court that all four of Erin's guests started to feel really ill on the Saturday night after the lunch. About 10 o'clock at night, they were vomiting, they had pretty severe diarrhea, and by the Sunday morning, all four of them, and remember they were quite elderly, they'd all been taken to hospital. Erin, in her evidence, claimed that she too was sick and that she too had started to suffer from diarrhea on the Saturday night, and that this was pretty severe and it continued for more than 24 hours. The defence was sceptical about this, and so we got into all sorts of quite grisly evidence about the details of Erin's diarrhea, the consistency of her poo, and there was one quite bizarre incident that was raked over several times in court when Erin had said that on the Sunday night, so 24 hours after the lunch, she'd driven her son to a flying lesson. He took flying lessons, and the flying school was about 90 minutes away. Now, the prosecution said, look, how did you drive 90 minutes when you had such explosive diarrhea that you claimed to be going to the toilet every 20 minutes?
Yeah. We all know that if you've got a bad tummy, not even as bad as supposedly Erin's was, you don't leave the house because you would be absolutely mortified to get caught short somewhere outside of your own home. If you've got a bad tummy, you don't want to leave your own loo, do you? And the thing is, she didn't have to go. I mean, it's different if you've got to go to work or you've got to go here or you've got to go there or whatever, I don't know, something urgent. But this wasn't urgent. This was a flying lesson that her son could have done anytime. And not only that, it was bloody miles away. It was an hour and a half drive. It wasn't just like a 10-minute drive around the corner. So it's completely ludicrous to think that if you had, a really bad tummy that Erin claims she did, that you would go on that trip. Anyway, she claims she did. And although her son did not remember it, she claims she had to go and do what bears do in the woods.
And Erin said in her evidence that actually her diarrhea was so bad that she was forced to stop by the side of the road, waddle off into the bush and do what those of us who are into camping know as a wild poo. She said she then cleaned herself up with some wet wipes and toilet roll she had in the car and put them in a dog poo bag that she disposed of at a petrol station later in the journey. She also claimed to have gone to the toilet in the petrol station, although the CCTV from that petrol station showed that she was only in there for about 9 seconds. Erin's case was that she was very, very sick, and on the Monday morning she went to hospital. Having presented there, she then decided to pop home again. She said she had to deal with her animals. She had dogs, she had sheep at home. Then she returned to the hospital and they ran a number of tests. The doctors concluded once they'd run her blood.
Yeah, remember that. She stayed 5 minutes and then she said she had to sort her daughter's ballet bag out, sort the animals out, and then apparently she had to lie down, all after being told that she could be dead within a day. Crazy. The more you go back on this, the more you realise how bloody ludicrous it is.
Actually, she wasn't that ill, and she checked out of hospital on the Wednesday. And again, this was something the jury had to think about. They had to work out whether, as the defence said, Erin was sick, but not as sick as her guests, or whether, as the prosecution contended, she was making the whole thing up. The next item of evidence, medical records. Erin Patterson didn't usually entertain people at her house. It was very rare. And in fact, Ian and Heather Wilkinson had never been to her house. The reason she invited them to the lunch involved her medical condition that she claimed to have been suffering for some time. Now, Erin had told her relatives that she had found a lump on her elbow, and several weeks before the lunch that she'd gone to a local hospital where they performed a needle biopsy and a scan to try and work out what this lump was. She exchanged text messages with Gail, her mother-in-law, and in those text messages, Gail had asked her how the tests had gone, and Erin had said, "Not bad, but there's a bit to unpack here, and I want to tell you all about it at the lunch we're going to have." She also exchanged text messages with her estranged husband, Simon, who she'd also invited to the lunch. Now, he decided not to go at the last minute. When he decided that the night before, Erin sent him a quite angry message saying, "Given the conditions, my medical conditions, this is likely to be the last chance I have to have an event like this for some time, and I'd really like you to attend." In court, it emerged, according to Ian Wilkinson, towards the end of the lunch, Erin had said she had an announcement to make, and she told her guests that she'd been diagnosed with cancer, specifically with ovarian cancer. When police began investigating the lunch, they of course pulled Erin's medical records, and they discovered in those medical records no evidence at all that she'd been suffering from cancer. She'd never been diagnosed with cancer. She'd never had tests on a lump on her elbow. She'd never had scans. There'd been no needle biopsy. The whole thing was a lie.
For me, this is the very worst lie that Erin told, and she told so many lies, but to say that you've got cancer for sympathy, there's people out there with cancer, to make, it's a horrible thing to say. Take all the other things away. Say you've got, I don't know, bloody COVID or something, or say she had to say she was like for maximum attention, maximum sympathy. And those people, they were nice, good, kind people. They prayed for her after she'd just murdered them. By the time they'd finished that lunch, they were dead people walking, and they didn't even know it. She knew it. As they were praying for her, she knew that they were going to die, or at the very least be seriously ill. What horrible, hateful woman. Sit there and watch them pray for her, laughing inside, smirking inside. She is the real evil of evils, in my opinion. Because those, as I say, those people, they were kind people, and she just mocked their religious beliefs, didn't she, with her friends and everything. Just mocked them for being decent people, and sat there and let them pray for her, even though she knew they were like carrying their deaths in their bodies. Then she knew she'd killed them, and just watched them pray for her. I don't think you can get much more horrible than that. Better she would have shot them really than that. To do that, make them feel sorry for her. I can't get over it sometimes.
Now, the prosecution's case is that Erin told this lie for a simple reason. They say she wanted to ensure that all of her guests came to the lunch because she was plotting to kill them all. Also, she wanted to make sure that her 2 children were not there, and that it didn't seem odd that they weren't there. So the guests and the children were told that the grown-ups had to talk about grown-up stuff. The adults were told that we need to have a sort of proper conversation. Now, when Erin was asked about this, when she gave evidence, she said something very different. Erin said that she'd actually been suffering, as we know, from body image issues, and she was really concerned about her weight. And that sometime in 2023, she decided it was time to get gastric band surgery. Now, Erin claimed she'd actually booked in for this surgery. And because it's quite a major procedure, she knew that in the days after the operation, she was going to need a bit of help with childcare. She didn't really want to tell everyone that she was having gastric band surgery because she was, in her words, embarrassed about it. So she cooked up the story about having cancer as what you might call a sort of white.
She wasn't embarrassed about anything because she was the number one on the planet. But it's interesting when he talks about this because she mentioned it one day and it was the next day that the prosecution had gone away and done their homework and realised that that place that she mentioned, the clinic she mentioned, they did not do that procedure there. So again, it comes back to that myth that Erin is intelligent. If she was intelligent, she would have given the name of a place that actually did do gastric bypass surgery, instead of talking about some place that didn't even do it. She's not clever. She is not clever.
It's a lie. Now, she was cross-examined about this by the prosecution barrister, Nanette Rogers, and asked, well, where was this gastric band surgery going to happen? Was it booked? In the witness box, Erin turned around and said, yes, I'd booked it for a day in September at a clinic in Melbourne called the Enrich Clinic. I was sitting in court at the time and I got my laptop out and I Googled the Enrich Clinic. I was fascinated by it. I'd never heard about it. It was a new piece of evidence. And it very soon became clear to me that this Enrich Clinic, it's a sort of cosmetic dermatology clinic. And I could find no evidence whatsoever that it performed gastric band surgery. Now, it looked...
Yeah, so she just said that. It's just what I mean. She's not clever, because if she was clever, she would at least given the name of a clinic that did gastric band surgery. But yeah, so it's interesting what he says, because I think that he said this was like a pivotal point, because all the lies she told anyway, and I know she wasn't on trial for lying, and that's what the judge told them to remember, wasn't it? She's not on trial for lying, thank God, because they would have come back within 5 minutes with a verdict, wouldn't they? She wasn't on trial for lying, but I think I think that jury probably wanted to believe Erin. No one wants to believe that somebody could be that evil. I think it's in our nature not to want to believe that people could do something so terrible. But then another lie, and this is something she said that she'd never said before, just suddenly she's just making it up as she goes along, really. So according to this guy, that was like a pivotal moment, and he was there. I wish I would have been there.
Looks like the prosecution did something very similar, because a day later, Nanette Rogers raised this issue and said they'd gone to the Enrich Clinic, they'd taken evidence from the people who ran it, and said to Erin Patterson, we've done our homework and we've discovered this place you said you were going to have gastric band surgery doesn't actually do gastric band surgery. Erin looked a bit surprised. She ummed and ahed. It wasn't a great moment for her in the witness box. She eventually said, oh, maybe I was wrong, maybe I was, confused, maybe I meant liposuction, something like that. In addition to admitting to lying to her own family about having cancer, she was also lying to the jury in the room on that day. And I think that may very well have sealed her fate. The next thing to come out of the box is a tablet. Police raided Erin Patterson's home twice. During those searches, they seized a huge number of devices. And on those devices, they found some quite interesting material. First thing they found was a lot of messages that Erin had exchanged with Facebook friends. She was a member of a true crime forum. She became quite friendly with the members of that forum, and during lockdown, they sort of splintered off into little groups, and they began talking about, their lives. Now, Erin Patterson, around this time, around sort of late 2022, had fallen out quite badly with Simon, her estranged husband. She and Simon separated in 2015, and for years things had been pretty amicable. They'd shared sort of parenting duties, their finances had been casually organised. Erin was actually quite a wealthy lady. She'd inherited an awful lot of money from her grandmother and then her mother, who died in around 2019. And she'd been very generous with the money. She'd loaned cash to members of Simon's family. At the end of 2022, Simon had put on his tax return that he was single. He'd previously been saying he was married, although they were living apart. And by saying he was single, Simon, he said when he gave evidence, he sort of did accidentally, didn't really think about it. By saying that had severe implications for Erin and her tax status, and it meant that she couldn't claim certain tax breaks and she was significantly poorer. And she was very upset about this. She contacted child support and said, look, if you're going to say, if you want to be single, we need to we need to organise our finances. And child support became involved, and they started arguing over who would pay the kids' medical fees, who would pay the school fees, how much money.
Yeah, it's all about control with Erin. She didn't like it when Simon said that without her permission. Do you know what I mean? It's like, as soon as she felt she was losing control, that's when it all went wrong. When she thought she was in control, Miss Moneybags Erin Patterson, doling out money to his relatives, being the queen bee of the whole family situation, she was fine. But once it all started, she started losing control. And I'll tell you what, if it comes out in the future that Simon had met someone else, I wouldn't be surprised. Because even though she didn't want him, I've seen it happen with people that I know. They don't want him, but they don't want anyone else to have him because they don't want a rival in their power thing. They don't want another woman getting involved, even though they don't want this man. They just do not want any rivalry to their complete control.
They should each have to live off, whose name should be on the deeds to all the properties they owned. And it became, for a time, quite a kind of heated argument. Their relationship deteriorated. And in late 2022, Erin had asked Simon's parents if they could get involved, maybe mediate. And Simon's parents had basically said, look, we don't feel comfortable doing that. All we can advise is that you two, work it out, maybe get together and pray together. And Erin had vented about this in considerable detail on some of these Facebook groups.
Do you imagine saying to Erin, because so she's trying to get them on her side, of course, and they weren't on anyone's side. They were just trying to be discreet, and they said, get together, pray, because that would be their answer to things, because they were religious people who believed in prayer. So for someone like Erin, who believes in absolutely nothing, although she kept pretending that she did, she doesn't believe in anything. She's an atheist. That would have just irritated her, because she's like, what do you mean? Pray. I'm the talk to me, support me. What do you mean pray? Even though at the end of the day, Simon was their relative. Not her. She was lucky that they even tried to support her a little bit, because there's plenty of in-laws out there wouldn't touch their in-law, if it was the husband or the wife, they blame them for everything. If it's not their relative, there's loads of them. So it seems like Dawn and Gail, etc., they were trying to be diplomatic, but, for her to tell someone like her to pray, she'd just think that was laughable.
So the messages they actually retrieved, messages she sent to her friends saying, I'm sick of this shit. I want nothing to do with them, meaning her in-laws. So fuck them. Another message says, this family, I swear to fucking God. In the context of the trial, this was important. The defence and Erin, right from the start of the case, had always maintained she loved her in-laws. Yeah. She was friendly to Simon. She didn't want to harm him or his family. And she was very upset that they died. This was just, words she exchanged in the heat of the moment, and should be seen in that context.
She couldn't even remember their names.
The prosecution's case, on the other hand, was that while she pretended to get on well with her in-laws, she actually really had fallen out with them quite badly, and that her real feelings towards her family, the ones that motivated the crime, were the feelings she expressed in these Facebook messages to her friends. The other important role that phones and tablets played in the trial involved triangulation evidence. So a mobile phone, when you use it, connects to a mobile phone mast. Your mobile phone, the one you carry around, is constantly searching for the best mast to get the best signal. So when you forensically examine them, experts are sometimes able to sort of work out where you were at any given moment. They can't do it with complete certainty. It doesn't quite work if you're underground or around hills or tall buildings. It can be a bit quirky, but they can draw a pretty good picture of where someone is and when. And using that evidence, they discovered that Erin Patterson had made 2 peculiar journeys to towns about half an hour, 45 minutes from Leongatha, where she lived. Those towns were called Loch and Outram. And that's significant because, as I mentioned before, death cap mushrooms aren't very common in the state of Victoria. But Erin turned out, according to analysis of her computers, turned out to be a pretty avid user of an internet site called iNaturalist. Now, it's a sort of citizen science website where people log sightings of interesting plants. Sightings had been logged on iNaturalist of death cap mushrooms in those towns. One of the people who'd actually logged one of the sightings was Tom May, the mushroom expert, Funky Tom. That was his username on iNaturalist. He'd logged a sighting of mushrooms, and on that very day, or the day after, Erin Patterson went to the town where that sighting had been and spent about an hour there. The prosecution's case was that this showed that she was deliberately trying to pick death cap mushrooms. Erin's defence was that she might have gone to the town on that day. She couldn't really remember, but if she did, it was nothing to do with mushrooms. The other crucial piece of evidence involving devices revolves around a potential cover-up. Erin used a number of different mobile phones, and it emerged during the trial that although police had seized several of them, there was one, probably the one she used the most in the run-up to the lunch, that they never found. The handset they did seize, which had been one she'd used over the previous couple of years, Erin had managed to wipe. Specifically, during the time the police were searching the house, she turned to a detective and said, "Look, I've got my children, I need to arrange some childcare, my daughter needs picking up. Do you mind if I go and make a call?" And for whatever reason, the detective said, fine. And she went off into another room in her house and she carried out a factory reset of her phone, completely wiped it. The prosecution's case was that this was important. This was evidence that Erin was orchestrating a cover-up because she knew she'd committed a crime and she thought there'd be evidence on her devices. Her defence was that, no, she'd simply panicked and, she was concerned, she was worried about the police searching her house, and it was the sort of thing someone does when they panic. The next piece of evidence is actually too big to fit into the box. It's down here, and it is a culinary device known as a food dehydrator. As I've mentioned, death cap mushrooms grow in Victoria in March or April.
Now, I have to say, that is nothing like Erin's dehydrator. Her dehydrator was black. I don't know if I've still got a picture of it up here, maybe not. But yeah, I mean, anyway, it doesn't have to look like no, it's not. So Erin's was more square, black. But anyway, so just to let you know, it doesn't look anything like the dehydrator Erin had. Well, when they finally realised she had one, of course.
And yet the lunch at which 3 of her guests died was in July. And as you and I both know, you can't stick a mushroom in the fridge and expect it to still be there in July. What Erin Patterson did, and in fact she did this on the very day that she'd travelled to Loch, she went to a local hardware store at the end of April and purchased a food dehydrator. The one she bought was made by a company called Sunbeam. And over the ensuing months, she seems to have become quite interested in dehydrating mushrooms. She would cut up mushrooms she'd bought from the supermarket and dry them out. She posted pictures to her Facebook group of herself drying out mushrooms. And she told her Facebook friends that actually what she was doing was that her children didn't really like mushrooms. She thought they were very nutritious, very good for you. And so she'd dry out these mushrooms, grind them into a powder and sprinkle the powder in her daughter's muffins. And this was a way of getting good nutrients into her daughter's otherwise poor diet. So here are 2 of the messages she sent about the mushroom dehydrator to her.
Now, as if you're trying to get vegetables into your kids, mushrooms would be what you would think of. You might think of broccoli or carrots or peas or any other veg. Would mushrooms really be the first vegetable you would think of trying to get down your kids? She is such a liar.
Facebook friends. So Fun fact, the dehydrator reduces mushroom mass by 90%. Do you think Woolies would mind if I bought the dehydrator into their vegetable section and dry things before I buy them? That's an Erin Patterson joke. The second message says...
He is funny, isn't he? It's like, oh, that's an Erin Patterson joke. He's like, Erin, she's so funny, isn't she? Apart from being intelligent, she's witty. Apparently her husband said that about her. Is that it? Is that a basis of a joke? Oh my God, I wonder if Woolies would mind if I took the mushroom. Oh, you can just imagine her saying it and thinking she's hilarious. Idiot. He says it so much less, he puts it over in a much more, calm manner than me. I get angry.
I've been hiding powdered mushrooms in everything, mixed it into the chocolate brownies yesterday. The kids had no idea. The jury was actually shown images that...
Do you know what? You just think them kids have had a lucky escape. I tell you, there come a day should be putting something else in their chocolate brownies or whatever. When they start going out of her control, this is what I just keep thinking about Erin. When she had to start coping with teenagers, older teenagers, young adults who are going to be, refusing to do what she asks them to do and, being perhaps even horrible to her. Because, unfortunately, kids are like that sometimes. God, they'd end up with a different kind of mushroom in their chocolate brownies then, wouldn't they? I wouldn't trust her around anybody.
They'd found on Erin's Samsung tablet of her food dehydrator with mushrooms in it. And actually the shelves of the dehydrator with mushrooms in them, they had scales on. She seemed to be weighing them. And they were taken, I think, in early May 2023. Now, those photographs were shown to Tom May, Funky Tom, the mushroom expert. And looking at the mushrooms in those pictures, he's...
Funky Tom. Yeah, I agree, Angel. Now, the thing is, Erin will have used her money to buy people's, control over people. As I say, I've known many people like that. You think they're doing you a favour, and you think, oh, that's kind of them, offering to pay that or... I don't know, lend you some money when you're really desperate, and there's always a price to pay with these kind of people. Seems okay, and then it's almost like a deal with the devil, and you don't see it at first. It's like, oh, I'll help you with that. You just pay me back when you can, blah, 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 and then... you realise what that means is till that's paid back, they own your soul. That's how I think Erin is.
Said I think his words were a high degree of certainty that the mushrooms Erin was drying out that day were death cap mushrooms. Now, the prosecution's case, given that there were scales, was that Erin was sort of weighing out a lethal dose of these mushrooms, which she was then going to grind into powder. The prosecution was of the view and wanted the jury to be of the view that Erin had ground these mushrooms down into powder and that she'd used the powder as a sort of concentrated poison, much like she'd been able to sprinkle dried field mushrooms into her daughter's brownies. She could also sprinkle dried death cap mushrooms into her guests' beef Wellingtons. The prosecution claimed that when she put dried mushrooms in her children's food, Erin was sort of practicing for the murder she intended to carry out several months later. Although it's slightly unclear how these found their way into the beef Wellingtons, Erin did talk a bit about making the beef Wellingtons, and she said in court that she'd been unable to buy a whole beef fillet in the Woolworths in her town, as it happens, and so she'd instead bought sort of slices of beef fillet sort of wrapped in plastic. She'd bought 6 of them, I think, in total. The prosecution pointed out that they thought this was a bit unlikely, that she'd had to adapt the recipe in the recipe book she used because she'd not been able to find a whole beef Wellington. The prosecution said, well, why didn't you just go to the local butchers? Why didn't you shop around? Why didn't you try and find an entire beef fillet? Erin never really came up with a convincing argument for that either.
How could you not find an entire beef fillet? I mean, it's not only their lies, they're ridiculous lies. Again, she's not intelligent. Not really. She's cunning, she's malevolent, she's malicious, she's sinister, but she is not intelligent. She thinks she is, and other people think she is because she's told them she is, probably for so long, but she literally is not.
It's one of the small things that helped seal her fate. Erin Patterson stayed in hospital until the Wednesday of the week after the lunch, and then they discharged her. She was fine. Everyone else was getting very sick indeed. They'd been transferred to hospitals in Melbourne, and 3 of the 4 people who had been at her lunch would die in hospital. And this brings me to my final piece of evidence. Well, this is a CCTV tape, a videotape. After being released from hospital or discharged from hospital on the Wednesday after the lunch, one of the very first things that Erin Patterson did, and it's an odd thing, is that she went to her local tip. And at that local tip, she took the food dehydrator that had been used, as we know, to dehydrate death cap mushrooms, and she disposed of it at the local tip. And the jury was shown CCTV of her doing that. The prosecution claimed, of course, that this was a weird attempt by Erin to cover up evidence, that the food dehydrator was a crucial piece of evidence that would prove that she'd poisoned her guests, and she wanted to get rid of it. And in her defense, Erin came up with a different claim. Erin said that while she'd been in hospital, she'd had a long conversation with her estranged husband, Simon, and during that conversation, they'd started talking about mushrooms, and actually started talking about dehydrated mushrooms and powdered mushrooms that she'd been feeding the children. Erin said that during that conversation, Simon had turned to her and said, "Powdered mushrooms, is that what you used to kill my parents?" Erin says that when Simon said that, she'd panicked. She had thought, crikey, he thinks I've murdered them. Social services were by then involved. They were talking about what to do with the children. And Erin says she panicked, and in that panic decided to dispose of the food dehydrator. It was silly, it was a terrible mistake, but that's kind of what she did. Now, Simon Patterson denied that any such conversation had taken place. His evidence was that it hadn't. And it was for the jury to decide who was telling the truth. But even if that conversation had happened, it seemed a bit...
Yeah, I wonder who was telling the truth. Could it be Erin, the serial liar, or would it be Simon? You know, it's a no-brainer, isn't it?
To my mind, sitting in court, it seemed very suspicious. So when the police went to the tip, they retrieved the food dehydrator and they took it for forensic analysis. And when they needed to be sure that it wasn't someone else's dehydrator, of course, that had just coincidentally been dumped there, but they found on it a number of fingerprints, and those fingerprints were found to belong to Erin Patterson.
Surprise,
and then when they subjected the food dehydrator to further analysis, they found death cap mushroom toxins on the shelves. I felt, sitting in court, that this was another really compelling piece of evidence, and it looks like the jury agreed. It's obviously a very unusual case, a very strange way to murder people, but adding to the surreal nature of this trial was the fact, although the eyes of the world were on court.
Yeah, very strange case. I think they're going to add this to the Cluedo. I'm going to make a Cluedo board, you know, like with a special thing for Erin, you know, on the patio, by Scudder the Nutter, on the patio with the death cap mushrooms or with the beef Wellington. Going to add it to the Cluedo board. Gosh, not many people. I mean, there have been some, you know, I know a case of someone who used poisoned eye drops to kill somebody. And quite often people use antifreeze, don't they, to poison people. You know, there's probably been, you know, but the thing is, poisoning, I reckon poisoning is probably the most likely to get undetected, because when you poison someone, you know, and their organs fail or whatever, it'd be difficult, you know, unless there's a reason why the hospital are looking for, you know, foul play. I think you've got more chance of getting, obviously someone walks into a hospital with a bullet hole, you know, or a bullet injury, it's obvious someone shot them or if they're stabbed. But poison is harder to detect. So she thought she was so clever.
What, there were 30 or 40 journalists there every single day and lots of TV crews loitering outside. The trial wasn't happening in some big metropolitan court in Melbourne. It was, in fact, happening instead in a tiny little mining town near to Erin's home called Morwell. Erin had specifically asked to have her case heard locally. I think she felt that maybe a kind of jury made up of country people, local people, might be more inclined to believe her. And perhaps she also thought that if she is going to go to prison for 30 or 40 years...
That's why I think it sort of came to me, it was like an epiphany. She chose to do the trial in Morwell because it was full of people like Don, Gail, Heather and Ian, who she thought she could just hoodwinkle because she's so superior and so intelligent. And she thought she had more chance of hoodwinking them than she would have with a more sophisticated jury in Victoria or wherever, Melbourne, where the Supreme Court is. That's exactly why I think she did it. She thinks she's so superior to so many people.
Maybe this would be a sort of last chance to be in the kind of community that she lived in. It meant that the trial was heard in a really small room. There was room for only kind of 30 or 40 people in there, seats for 4 journalists at any one time. We all had to take part in a ballot to be in the room. Lots of locals were queuing up from dawn to be in there as well. It was quite compelling. At the start of the trial, the judge had to tell the jurors, look, you know, you're probably going to end up bumping into lawyers, barristers, over the next 6 to 8 weeks. As you pop out for lunch, you might see members of the press, you might see people who are in court. Don't talk to them, and they're not going to talk to you, but don't think it's because they're being rude. That's just the rules. That's how a trial is conducted. You, the jurors, have to just reach your decision based on the evidence you've heard in court. And this was a case where there was no one piece of what I'd say is kind of killer evidence. There was no one item that definitively proved Erin Patterson's guilt, but there were lots of little things. Yeah. And added together, it was like a sort of jigsaw. When you put all the pieces together, you get a clear picture. And in my mind, she is clearly a very clever, calculating woman and clearly a murderer. I think what sealed it for me really was seeing her on the stand. In any trial, the prosecution goes first. You hear their evidence. It took several weeks. And then it came time for the defence's evidence. And I was kind of thinking, well, what is the defense case? How can she explain lying about having cancer? How does she explain buying a food dehydrator, going to those places where...
Yeah, and I agree completely with him. But the other thing is, I think once it was clear that it was only her who was giving evidence, and over 3 days, you know, where were her experts to back up what she was saying? Where were her character witnesses? Where were people speaking on her behalf? There wasn't any. You know, when you take over 50 witnesses for the prosecution and just one, the actual perpetrator for the defence, you realise there is no defence. You know, no defence whatsoever.
The mushrooms were growing, looking them up on the iNaturalist website, drying out the mushrooms, making individual beef Wellingtons rather than one big one. What about, you know, her not getting as sick as her guests? How is she going to explain all of that? And I eventually realised that really the only person who could speak to any parts of her case was Erin herself, and therefore that it was going to be inevitable that she would have to go into the witness box. And I think she spent 8 or 9 days there. The first sort of 3 or 4 of them saw her being kind of cross-examined by her counsel, Colin Mandy, for the defence. She looked quite comfortable. In fact, she came across quite well. But as soon as the prosecutor, Nanette Rogers, got her on the stand and started really kind of picking apart some of the things she said, interrogating her, asking her to explain things that didn't quite add up, we saw Erin sort of being caught up in I suppose what I'd call a web of lies. She had to admit that she'd lied to her family about having cancer. She had to admit that she'd lied to the police about the food dehydrator, that she'd secretly tried to dump it. She had to admit that there was something didn't quite add up about the Asian supermarket. And eventually she came across really as someone who was just a bit too shifty. And when it emerged that she'd also lied about gastric band surgery and that the clinic she said she was going to for the surgery just didn't do that kind of thing. At that point, I think something broke in the jury, and you saw them exhaling quite deeply. And I thought at that point her goose was probably cooked. And so it proved. Now you've heard all the most important pieces of evidence, and perhaps you understand why the jury found Erin Patterson guilty. If you'd like to...
Oh, most definitely understand why they found her guilty. And yeah, exactly. You know, although the judge was saying to people, she's not on trial for lying, but what point does it come to? What point does it come to when you think, you know, how many lies can someone tell before you start not believing anything that they say? You know, it's just... No, she wasn't on trial for being a liar, but she never stopped lying. You know, and she's expecting people to believe her about the later things she said, and obviously she couldn't be believed. But anyway, she's guilty. She's been found guilty. I just wanted to show you that. I thought it was good. I thought it was a good summary of Erin. I mean, we've got sentencing to come. Also, as I said, we'll be doing a video with these myths about Erin, like that she's intelligent. That's a myth. That she's a good mother. She's not a good mother. That she's a good cook. She's not a good cook. All those things that people are saying about her, it's just not true. So we're going to talk about that on another